Ready? Okay. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us for this AARP webinar on fiscal policy challenges and solutions in Alaska. I'm Madeline Holdorf, Volunteer State President for AARP Alaska. AARP is a nonpartisan social impact organization serving Americans 50 years of age and over. Our broad mission is focused in the areas of health security, financial resilience, and social connections so that we can all choose how and where we live as we age. I personally have chosen Alaska, to where I will continue to age. I came to Alaska 42 years ago during the very tail end of the pipeline boom. And then I stayed through to the 80s when the economic downturn caused my friends to move to the lower 48. And since that time, we've seen the barrel of oil prices plummet and to almost to a point where we had to give it away at a certain time. Our state is facing budget challenges. and will need to make important decisions about how we can best address those challenges to continue providing health and financial security and economic opportunities to Alaskans of all ages, and older Alaskans in particular. AARP Alaska recently fielded a survey to gauge AARP member knowledge, attitudes, and support for potential solutions to our state's fiscal situation. Thank you to all of those who participated in that survey with us. In this survey, we asked AARP members a variety of questions about our state's budget and possible solutions to address the fiscal problems Alaska faces. Today, our AARP Alaska Advocacy Director, Marge Stoneking, will share the results of that survey and the findings. Before hearing from Marge, we'll gain insights from Larry Persily, a former state deputy commissioner of revenue, about Alaska's current budget situation. If you have questions throughout the next hour, please type them in the chat box, and we'll have someone monitoring that, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can after the presentations. I'd like to now introduce AARP member and volunteer, Larry Persily, to give us an overview of the fiscal challenges Alaska is facing. Larry has split his 45 years in Alaska between journalism and public policy work for state, federal, and municipal offices, focusing on taxes, fiscal policy, and oil and gas. He has worked for the Associated Press, the Anchorage Times, the Anchorage Daily News, the Juneau Empire, Petroleum News, and has owned weekly newspapers in Wrangell, Juneau, and Skagway. During his career in government, Larry served as Deputy Commissioner of the Alaska Department of Revenue, in the Governor's Office, for the House Finance Committee, and he led a federal agency assisting with the development of the Alaska North Slope Natural Gas Pipeline Project. He also served as Chief of Staff to the Kenai Peninsula Borough Mayor. It is my great pleasure to introduce Larry Persily. Larry, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Madeline, and thank you for the resume. My mother would be happy to hear that. I was wondered what I do. So I've got, I don't know, 16 slides, not too many. I'll go through them quickly, but my point with this is to explain kind of where we are and why I don't think there's a way to the future without some sort of taxes in Alaska. There's not enough oil, and federal government's not going to keep bailing us out forever. We've had 40 years in Alaska with no taxes and 40 years of free money with the dividend, which has helped a lot of people, but I don't think that can continue. So starting with the first slide, I think before you even had the argument with a neighbor about taxes, there'll be people say, I got to cut the budget. Well, the truth is, in the span of about 4 years, state agency GF, general fund, that's the money that the state can argue about as opposed to federal money or designated funds for Medicaid or things. But state agency general fund budgets have been cut 15%, more than $600 million in a period. And it's been sort of flat since then because for all of them, the losers, if you want to say, the Department of Natural Resources has been cut. University of Alaska has been cut significantly in the last few years. As those have been cut, other costs have increased, public safety, Department of Corrections. As the state is paying off its mortgages, we're saving money, but retirement fund payments are going up. So it's really been kind of a flat line in the last few years. Meanwhile, because we have had minimal capital budgets or public works budgets, we've got this huge backlog of deferred maintenance statewide, which we have not addressed. So I guess my point is, even among big advocates in the legislature of cutting the budget, they're starting to see, they've really cut the big numbers that are out there. There's just little nips and tucks left, but it's most legislators seem to agree now that they've cut as much as they can of significance. So the next slide illustrates, if you look at and the guy who made this for me obviously thinks everyone has incredible eyesight, so forget the little numbers at the bottom that even I can't read. But what this shows is from 1978 to 2021, if you look at per capita state spending of state dollars, adjusted for inflation to 2019, we're spending the same per capita state dollars adjusted for inflation today as we were of about $6,000, a little more than $6,000 as we were back in 1978. We had the huge spike in state spending when oil pipeline came on, started back, had a period there in 2008, 2009, oil prices spiked again, so we spent money, have cut dramatically since then. So for those who say we're spending a lot more, we're really not. Next slide. Alaska transition years ago, we are in terms of revenue, not attitude, but in terms of revenue, we transitioned from being an oil state to an investment state long ago, and there's no turning back, I don't think. If you look at fiscal year 2022, which is the year that starts July 1, it's the year fiscal year the legislature's arguing about now, more than $3 billion of the budget's coming from the permanent fund earnings. About a third of that is coming from all the oil taxes and royalties. Less than 10% is coming from all other non-taxes fees, cigarettes, alcohol, motor fuel. We're an investment earnings state. That's where we get most of our money, and that's probably not going to change. So at that, drawing 5% from the permanent fund with oil where it is, you sort of got a kind of a close to a balanced budget, but no dividend. And that certainly is a political problem. So to the next slide, if you think long-term, oil is going to continue to decline in production. There's that uncertainty of where the price is going to be. A broad-based tax, which is code word for sales tax or income tax, would give us some stability. You'd know the money was coming in regardless of oil prices, regardless of what the federal government is doing. The state of Alaska used to have an income tax. We had it for 30 years. Income tax was adopted in 1949, and in 1980, as we started getting rich with oil, the legislature abolished the income tax. So it's not new. We've just had two generations who have never paid it. Sales tax, income tax, people say, well, how much could you raise? How high do you want the rate? If you had, say, a statewide sales tax year-round of 2%, it would depend, assume you exempt medical expenses and food, but depending whether you exempt rent, what you do with utilities, a 2% statewide sales tax could raise you $200, $300, $400 million a year. A income tax where you paid 2% of your gross income for the year might raise $500 million, but again, you can adjust that on the percentages. Now, an income tax would collect more money from non-resident workers. A sales tax would collect some money from tourists, assuming we get tourists back next year. So either way, some of that money is going to come out of the pockets of non-residents, which is better than coming out of our pockets, I suppose. The next slide just illustrates how much we are dependent. This is for fiscal year 2020, which ended last year. More than 2/3 of the money that went into the state came from the federal government. Investment earnings, which is permanent fund, less than 20% from oil, and then it just drops off after that. I think, again, emotionally, we still think of ourselves as an oil state, but we're really living off federal money and permanent fund earnings. That's next slide. So last winter, the Department of Revenue was saying, oh, oil might be around $40. Things are really going to be bad. Well, things got better. in the spring forecast, they said, well, we think oil is going to stay in the 60s this year, next year. That difference added almost $800 million to the state general fund for the 2 fiscal years. And they were basing it on $61 oil. It's actually a few dollars higher than that. So if oil stays in the 60s, life's a lot better in Alaska. We don't have a huge deficit unless we pay out. It might stay in the 60s. It depends on the world economy, the pandemic. If there's too much supply, oil could easily drop back into the 50s or even into the 40s at some point. So the next slide, as we talk about the state's fiscal reliance on investment earnings and federal money and our aversion to taxes or bring back taxes so we can afford the services we need. We do have a governor who finds it hard to say the word taxes, likes talking about budget cuts. He has given no specifics, but his 10-year plan pencils in another $450 million in budget cuts over 3 years. He says, the economy's too weak now for taxes. Maybe when we get past COVID, we can have additional revenue measures. Again, he just will not say the word tax. His 10-year plan admits that if you have a big dividend, you're going to have a $1 billion deficit every year to find the money to cover that dividend check. And again, he just refers to, well, we'll fill that with other revenue sources, but gives no indication of what those might be. Now, he has called a special session of the legislature for this year to address that, but really hasn't laid out. The only specific proposal he sort of floated out there was gambling, state-sanctioned gambling. Next slide. So for this year, oil prices are helping, and the state is getting a lot of money. This is the latest, the American Rescue Plan Act, which is not to be confused with, I think it was called the HEROES Act from December, or the CARES Act from last spring. The state's going to get $1 billion under the rescue plan that they can spend at their choosing, more money for capital projects, more housing assistance, municipalities, schools will get their own allocation. It's, I think, ironic, last year with the CARES Act, where the state got $1.25 billion, there are a lot of strings attached. This year, the only strings attached to the federal money, the feds are saying you cannot use this federal aid to cut taxes, which I kind of laugh at. We're not using it to cut taxes, we're using it to avoid taxes. But legislature is meeting under special session to try to figure out how to spend $1 billion. On the next slide, just real quickly, last year when the CARES Act money came in, the legislature was not in session and the governor got to make spending decisions. This year, they will stay in session for whatever it takes. They want to make the decisions. Even though municipalities got their own allocation of federal aid under this American Rescue Plan, some of the communities, Ketchikan and Skagway, Denali Borough, that are so heavily dependent on tourism sales tax money, bed tax money, they don't feel they got enough from the federal allocation and they want to share the state's money. So that'll be a political debate. So as we go through this on the next slide, I think we need to keep in mind that the federal money is temporary. Yeah, it's going to help us this year because what we'll do with that federal pandemic relief money is use it to pay some of the state's bills, or the legislature and the governor will use it to pay some of the state's bills so the state money can be available to pay a dividend this year. It's kind of a fund shift, it's called, but it is temporary. You know, it doesn't solve the problem long term. And long term in Alaska, the problem we have is without a sales tax, without an income tax, if there are jobs created in the state, economic activity created in the state gets nothing for the treasury to pay for the services that those jobs, people, families, businesses need. It's like at a grocery store, they pull you in and then they make money off something. We don't make money off anything unless it's a barrel of oil. State really doesn't make any substantial money off economic activity, and it's not good long term. People talk about diversification. Well, it doesn't do anything to diversify the state treasury. So I got about, I think, 5 left. On the next slide, I would argue time is short. The permanent fund, as of a month and a half ago, their last fiscal statement had about $14 billion that's available. That's not the principal you can't touch. That's just accumulated earnings. But the state's taking out more than $3 billion a year to pay for public services and dividends. This is under a law from 2018 that says you can take 5% or no more than 5% each year from the fund's total market value. So if you're drawing out $3 billion a year, yeah, 14 sounds like a lot, but keep in mind, just like oil prices, earnings are volatile. During the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the permanent fund lost $6 billion. So you got to think, what if I have another bad year? I lose 5 or 6 billion. I still need my 3 billion every year. All of a sudden, that 14 billion isn't looking well. It's not guaranteed. Now the governor has said he doesn't want to deal with taxes. He wants a big dividend. He wants to take an extra $3 billion from the fund this year. He says, don't worry, that'll buy us some more time. So I can explain that in a couple slides, but there's a lot of legislative opposition to taking more money out of the permanent fund and thinking it's like some piggy bank that just replenishes itself. Just briefly, the Alaska economy, even before COVID, we've lost population 4 years in a row. We've had more people leaving than moving here. We're just not as attractive a state. Our economy is not as attractive. Job growth is not as attractive as it had been in the lower 48. Again, pre-COVID. I guess the question will be, as the lower 48 economy picks up and there are more jobs outside than there are in Alaska, will we see more Alaskans leave in 2021, 2022, and beyond? So on the next slide, the governor's fiscal plan is a constitutional amendment to restructure the permanent fund so it's a true endowment. You don't have this magical line between principal and earnings. It's just a true endowment. You take 5% out a year. The theory is you're going to earn 6 or 7% a year on average, long term. So if you take out 5%, the fund will continue to grow as long as you don't exceed how much you withdraw. Now, the governor wants a constitutional amendment to put the dividend into the Constitution, and not only to say there shall be a dividend, but that the Constitution would dictate how big it is. He says there should be a 50-50 split of that 5% draw. Now, most legislators like the idea of amending the Constitution for the permanent fund to really treat it like an endowment, but there's no agreement on whether the dividend should go in the Constitution and should become a star just like education, or even if you put the dividend in, if you put hard wire into the Constitution the size of it. The governor also, besides for putting the dividend, the amount of the dividend in the Constitution, also wants a constitutional amendment that says there shall be no new tax or increase to an existing tax, no new tax without a vote of the public. So his calendar says in November 2022, voters could vote constitutional amendment that says no new tax without a vote of the public, and then you'd have to vote again on the new tax. If there was one, that'd be 2023. You wouldn't start collecting money till 2024. Under his plan, it's a long ways out before any new revenue shows up. Legislature this year actually considered raising the motor fuel tax, which hasn't been increased in more than half a century, and they ran out of nerve on that one too. So just a few more. The dividend, it's the political flag that you wrap yourself around in Alaska if you want to win. The budget actually kind of balances around $65 a barrel, no dividend. If you want a dividend, you got to come up with the cash somewhere. You can take extra out of the permanent fund. This year, they're going to use federal aid to cover some state spending. That'll free up some money for dividend. But if it's too much of a dividend, you're going to have to draw more out of the permanent fund. And that's where they can't agree, and that's why they're in special session. So just real quickly, a little bit more on the governor's plan on the next slide. So again, he says, put in the Constitution, half the money goes to dividends, half to the budget. The power cost equalization account, which subsidizes electricity in rural communities. He says, well, let's protect that in the Constitution. That's just a political ploy to gain rural support. Wants to take some more money out of the earnings to buy us time to come up with a fiscal plan, which he's not that big on anyhow. So last couple here. He also wants a constitutional amendment to limit state spending. The amendment that would block the legislature from adopting any new taxes without approval. And he also wants to amend the Constitution so that if the legislature wanted to raise an existing tax, like oil tax or motor fuel tax, instead of a majority vote of the legislature, it would require 2/3, which puts it near the word impossible. And even if citizens get together an initiative on the ballot, such as an oil tax initiative, his constitutional amendment would say, well, that can't go until the legislature approves it. So it negates the citizens' initiative. None of these are going to go through, I don't think. So I guess in closing, look, I'm a pessimist. I'm sorry about it. It's just the way it is. But I'm happy to take questions at the end of this.
Thank you so much, Larry and Madeline, for volunteering your time and leadership. We absolutely can't do AARP work without volunteers, and we're grateful for you. Now, hopefully I've switched over the slides to the next PowerPoint. And now that we've looked at the lay of the land and talked through some of the challenges that Alaska faces, we're going to talk about where AARP members land on potential solutions. So in March, AARP contracted with Dittman Research, a long-established Alaskan scientific survey research firm, to conduct our survey. As mentioned earlier, our intent with this survey was to assess AARP member knowledge, attitude, and support regarding the state's long-term budget challenges and potential state budget solutions. In the survey, we tested 5 possible solutions: budget cuts, a statewide sales tax, a statewide income tax, increasing oil and gas taxes, and capping the PFD. So the methodology tells us how Dittman Research conducted the survey. It was a survey of 428 AARP Alaska members with regional, geographic, age, and gender quotas to ensure fair statewide representation. It was conducted half on telephone, half on cell phones, and half on landlines. And the response data has been weighted to be a highly representative sample in terms of geography, political registration, gender, and age to match Alaska's census data and voting records. You can see here on the state map the geographic representation and weighting by region to match the population distribution of the state. And here on this slide on demographics, in addition to geographic representation, House survey responses reflect a variety of older age groups in the AARP membership category, and political party on the left column, and education level, employment status, race, and income level on the right column. AARP serves all 50+ Alaskans, and our membership is statewide. We span the political spectrum, the education and employment spectrums, and the full scale of household income levels. And so those are the same spreads represented in this survey. Though this 2021 survey is focused on state budget challenges and solutions, given where we are as a country and a world, we took the opportunity to check in with our members to ask how the pandemic has impacted them. So those are the first few slides I'm going to share. In relation to the pandemic, we asked survey respondents if they were worried about their health or the health of others in their household, if they were worried about their long-term personal financial situation, their current financial situation, and we asked if they were worried about job security for themselves or others in their household. And the scale you see here on the slide goes from very worried in red on the left to not at all worried in blue on the right. You can see in the top bar that nearly half of AARP members say they are worried about their health or someone in their household due to the pandemic. And on the bottom 3 bars, you can see that financial and job security are less concerning to members compared to health concerns when we look at the data over all respondents. While health concerns are the greatest concern across all regions, when we look at the breakout, you'll see highlighted under region that rural AARP members also report higher levels of concern for current and long-term personal finances. Next, under age groups, we see that the greatest worry is again among health among all age categories, but you'll see that financial and job security worries are higher among younger AARP members. And similarly, under household income, you can see that lower income members reported more concern about jobs and finances in addition to health concerns, which all income levels reported. Specifically, when we asked about whether household income has declined, they've had a layoff in the household, or a cut in pay or hours since the pandemic began, there are specific trends among age groups and income levels as well. The pie charts on the left show the overall responses to whether member households had experienced a drop in income in the top chart, a job layoff or furlough in the middle, or a pay cut in the bottom chart. And then in the table at the right are the responses by age group, income, and income level, where you can see that the higher the age group or income level, the smaller number of members were impacted by income drop, layoffs, or pay cuts. AARP members under age 75 are much more likely to report having been financially impacted by COVID than those 75 and up, probably because more of us are in the workforce. And households with lower income levels are much more likely to have reported that their income had declined. And concern about job security is also elevated among low-income households. So moving on to the fiscal topic that we're here for. Before Alaskans were asked to respond to our budget survey questions, the surveyors read them a brief paragraph about Alaska's financial situation to be sure that everyone answering the survey had the same basic level of information. And this is somewhat of a recap of what we just heard from Larry Persily. And it read, for many years, Alaska used its oil revenues to balance the state budget and fund state services and programs. At the same time, the state used permanent fund earnings to issue dividend checks to all Alaska residents. But as oil revenues declined, the state reduced spending on services and programs and used the state savings account to help balance its budget. Now the state savings account is nearly depleted, and the state is using permanent fund earnings to help pay for services and issue dividend checks to residents. Without enough oil revenue or state savings to draw from, Alaska is considering additional cuts and new ways to raise revenue to help balance the state budget, maintain state programs and services, and continue issuing permanent fund dividend checks. We started by asking survey participants how they would rate the current condition of the economy in Alaska. In the top left bar chart, we see that overall 86% of AARP members who responded to this survey rate Alaska's economy as only fair or poor. And in the top, in the top right table, you can see that assessment is generally consistent across all demographic subgroups. And then at the bottom, you can see that we asked about their awareness of Alaska's budget challenges prior to having read them that paragraph. The responses are depicted in the bottom left bar chart, where we see that nearly 4 out of 5 AARP members have heard a great deal or a fair amount about the long-term budget challenges that Alaska faces. In this next slide, we begin to ask about potential solutions to solve the state's budget crisis. And the scale on this slide goes from strongly support in blue on the left to strongly oppose in red on the right. So we asked first about cuts. And if they supported or opposed state budget cuts. And you can find these in order top to bottom. State budget cuts to state funding to local governments that pay for services such as fire and police protection, senior centers, buses and local road maintenance, and parks and recreation. Next, public safety, courts and jails cuts. Third, cuts to public education, including K-12 and higher education. 4, cuts to transportation and infrastructure, such as the state highway and highway system and road maintenance and the ferry system. Next, cuts to health services for children and low-income families. And finally, cuts to home care services for older Alaskans or those with disabilities, such as Meals on Wheels, personal care assistance, or transportation services. There's considerable opposition to all of the budget cuts tested in this survey is what we found, and you see that by the predominance of the color red on the screen. Cuts to state funding of local government services, that top item, top bar chart, received the least opposition, but still only about a quarter of AARP members support that. Next, we turn to revenue solutions, and to begin examining potential revenue solutions, we started by asking about support or opposition to a statewide sales tax. Here's the question and the level that we tested. As you may know, Alaska does not collect a state sales tax. Would you support or oppose a state sales tax of 3% on goods and services as a way for Alaska to help balance the state budget and maintain state programs and services? A state sales tax of 3% was strongly supported initially across all demographics, as you can see in the top charts. Two-thirds support in the pie chart you can see, and this is overall data. Net support, which you see in that little box at the right, simply means total support minus total oppose. In the bottom left table, on the regional breakout, you'll see that interior members voiced the highest rate of support for sales tax and Southeast the lowest. And in the tables on the bottom right, we see that younger AARP members and higher income members voiced the most support for a statewide sales tax. However, we next shared that many communities in Alaska already collect a sales tax at the local level of up to 7%. So we asked members, would you support or oppose Alaska imposing a state sales tax of 3% if it means some communities could face a higher combined sales tax rate of as much as 10%? And when taking into consideration that a statewide sales tax would be added on top of those local sales taxes, for a potential combined sales tax rate for some communities of 10%, support for a sales tax decreased from 67% down to 43%, which changes that net support number to -13, meaning that a small majority now actually opposes the tax proposal. We took this question a step further and asked, we shared that some people are opposed to state sales tax or to sales taxes in general because they say they could be a burden on low-income families because they would be spending a greater share of their earnings on taxable goods than higher income families. And then we asked the question again, considering this, would you support or oppose state sales tax of 3%? What you see in the bottom chart is that informing AARP members about the potential burden on low-income families decreased support for a statewide sales tax as well, from 67% down to 58%, but not nearly to the extent that the local sales tax consideration did, which you see in the top half of this slide. Another approach being considered to raise revenue in Alaska is a state income tax. And there are different ways and, of course, rates for income taxes. What we surveyed on was a state graduated personal income tax ranging from 2.5% to 7% of taxable income, which means those who earn higher incomes would pay a higher tax rate than those with lower incomes, with the range of 2.5% on the low end to 7% on the high end for the highest income earners of your taxable income, not dissimilar to how federal income taxes work. And in the survey, we asked, would you support or oppose Alaska implementing the graduated income tax system as described as a way to help balance the state budget and maintain state services and programs? Overall, as depicted in the top right pie chart, a state graduated income tax is supported by a wide margin as well. In the top left chart, you can see that opinions on both sides of the issue regarding income tax are strong, with 40% strongly supporting and 32% strongly opposing. The strongly support, however, does exceed the strongly oppose. And when we drill down in the regional and age bracket tables at the bottom left, we see that South Central, excluding Anchorage, and rural AARP members support an income tax by a somewhat smaller margin than the rest of the state. And members under age 65 are evenly divided at 50-50 on an income tax, with support increasing with age among AARP members. In the bottom right, tables for employment and age groups, we see that support for an income tax increases among those who are retired. And the highest support among income tax groups is the middle income tax brackets, which we combined as 60,000 to 99,000 a year in per household income. Next, we asked about oil and gas tax and increasing that. And so when we asked about support or opposition to increasing the existing oil and gas tax on companies in Alaska as a way to help balance the state budget and maintain state services and programs, AARP members voiced support for increasing those taxes by a very wide margin, as seen in the top right, bottom left pie chart, 68%. AARP members, and the majority of those AARP members voiced strongly support at 51%, which you see at the top left, which pointed out with the arrow. So 51% strongly support increased oil and gas taxes. And then again at the bottom, or at the right, I'm sorry, you can see the demographic breakouts. And in this case, you can see wide margins of 2-to-1 or greater support across all regions, member age groups, and income levels. So for our last revenue raiser question for helping to solve the state's budget issues, we turned our attention to the PFD. AARP member, and we asked about capping the PFD. AARP members support capping PFD checks by a margin of 14% overall. That's the net support in that little blue box. Note that a particular cap was not tested, so a particular dollar amount was not cap level for the PFD was not tested in this survey, just the concept of a cap. So in terms of strong support and strong opposition, however, views are nearly evenly divided, with 35% strongly support and 33% strongly oppose. Regionally, on the right in the table, you can see that capping the PFD is supported everywhere except South Central region outside of Anchorage by a very narrow margin. And the margin of support is also somewhat lower in rural Alaska. You can see in the bottom two tables on age and household income that support goes up with both age and income, and opposition goes down with age and income. So younger and lower income AARP members are more likely to say they oppose capping the PFD at a particular level, while older and higher income members support it by wide margins. Finally, we asked respondents to rank in order of preference the 6 options for addressing the state's budget challenges that were proposed in this survey. 1 being the most preferred and 5 being the least preferred. And the scale here goes from 4 and 5 in red on the left as least preferred, to 3 in purple in the middle, to most preferred or 1s or 2s on the right. So increasing oil taxes, and these are presented in order of support. So, or in order of preference from most preferred to least preferred. Increasing oil taxes is rated as the preferred way to balance the state budget. 42% rank it as their top choice, and 4 out of 5 or 80% rank it as one of their top 3. This high ranking is also consistent with the strong support results of the earlier question on raising oil and gas taxes from their current level. Following oil and gas taxes, AARP members prefer a sales tax and income tax at its very similar rates, followed by capping the PFD. Cuts to state spending is ranked last, with only 38% ranking cuts in their top 3. And what you see in the table on the right is the mean ranking, or sort of, I guess, average ranking on the 5-point scale. And it's just a different way of presenting how they fall in that priority order that we just went through. So to recap the key findings in this survey of AARP Alaska members, there's very little appetite for additional budget cuts among AARP members. Cuts to state spending on local government assistance or funding, public safety, education, transportation, health services for low-income families and children, and home care services for seniors are opposed by 71 to 86% of AARP members. So a plurality of a majority strongly oppose these cuts. 2/3 of AARP members initially overall support a 3% state sales tax. However, when participants were informed that a local sales tax community would result in a combined rate of as high as 10% for many communities, support for a state sales tax dropped to just below majority at 48%. A graduated income tax is supported by a margin of 18% overall, a wide margin, and there are strong opinions on both sides of the issue. But strong support for income tax does exceed strong opposition by a margin of 8%. Younger AARP members and those working full-time are more divided on this issue. Capping PFDs as a way to help balance the budget and maintain state services is supported by a margin of 15% overall. And margins of support for capping the PFD are higher among older and higher income members. South Central members, those under age 65, and those with household incomes under $60,000 a year are much more likely to oppose capping the PFD checks. AARP members support increasing taxes on oil and gas companies by a very wide margin, 39% support, and the majority of members at 51% strongly support this. Wide margins of support are seen across all demographic subgroups in this survey. Increasing oil taxes is also ranked as the preferred way to balance the state budget when we asked respondents to rank the solutions. Following oil taxes in the rankings, members prefer a sales tax or income tax, then capping the PFD. but cuts to state spending is ranked last, lagging the other priorities significantly. So our voices as older Alaskans are important to legislators and particularly impactful when we join them together under the banner of AARP. And here's why. You can see in the top left pie chart that Alaska's senior population represents just over a third of registered voters in the state. But what you see in the top right pie charts is an outsized impact in elections, particularly in the lower turnout elections such as primaries. And so it's 40% turnout of 55 plus in generals and 58% turnout of the total voters in an election in the primary. And those were both the 2020 elections. Older Alaskans consistently participate in voting at higher rates than any other age group, which is what you see on the bottom two bar charts, particularly, and at 10 percentage points or more than general voter turnout rates. So we know that today's older Alaskans want to stay to age in Alaska, as Madeline indicated for herself early in the presentation. And a sustainable Alaska is important to AARP members. A sustainable Alaska means resolving Alaska's structural budget challenges. So to get to the so what of this survey, I think the messages to legislators from AARP are that the strongest voting group in Alaska, older Alaskans, support revenue solutions over cuts to state services or cuts to the PFD. The message regarding increased oil and gas taxes is that despite the failed ballot measure this past year, the 50 plus support an increase there and perhaps prefer a legislative decision over the ballot box. And perhaps most importantly, older Alaskans are keenly aware of the state fiscal challenges and are willing to do their part to ensure a sustainable Alaska for future generations. That is, there is support for either a graduated personal income tax or a state sales tax that makes allowances for local sales tax payments. So we'll be sharing these messages with legislative leadership at this upcoming telephone town hall with Senate President Peter Machicki and Speaker of the House, Louise Stutes. We hope that you will join us, and you can sign up at aarp.org /AK and look under upcoming events to register for the telephone town hall on June 2nd. The legislature is now in special session called by Governor Dunleavy to come to agreement and pass a budget for the state fiscal year that begins July 1st. And as Larry indicated earlier, the governor has also called a special session for August to consider those constitutional amendments regarding the PFD and the earnings account of the permanent fund. Legislative leadership has indicated that the longer-term discussion on budget sustainability and new revenues will take place during that August special session, so that the legislators, can have the summer or June and July to hear from constituents on these issues back in their districts. So again, we invite you to join us on June 2nd at noon to hear from our legislative leadership about this session and hear what their ideas and thoughts are about Alaska's budget and sustainability, their fiscal plans. To sign up to be called to participate in this opportunity to ask your questions live of legislative leadership, go to aarp.org /AK and find Teletown Hall under upcoming events. I also invite you to reach out to me, Marge Stoneking, as Advocacy Director of AARP Alaska, by email at mstoneking@aarp.org if you are interested in getting more involved in our legislative advocacy work at AARP Alaska. So with that, we're going to go to questions, and we have Barry Taben-Berger, our State Government Affairs Rep from AARP in DC, to share audience questions for Larry and I in particular.
Hello, Alaska. That was fabulous. Thank you very much, everyone. So let's see. I had seen two questions pop up in the question and answer box, and they appear to be answered. but I'm going to just say them. Larry, I don't know if you answered them or perhaps Marge did, but you did. But maybe, I don't know if everybody got to see them, so folks might want to hear. And some of them actually might have been answered after your presentation, Marge, because one question was about potentially increasing the share of what oil pays right now. In other words, this was when Larry was talking about ways to help the state budget. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, Larry, or give your answer to everyone. And Marge as well, we saw in the survey that in fact, other folks were thinking along the way that this audience member was, because people supported the idea of increased oil taxes on oil. So why don't you guys go ahead?
Okay, and I've got about 10 minutes and then I've got to go to another event. Yeah, I personally think oil taxes should be increased somewhat. Last year's citizens initiative that would have more than doubled them was far too excessive. It is a competitive world out there and the oil industry is actually in permanent decline. So if you want to double the taxes, you're just going to run out of oil revenue sooner because no one is going to invest here in the future if the tax rates double. So yes, I think they should increase a moderate amount, but we've also got to realize it's got to be competitive or we lose investment and long-term we have less oil. Also, on a personal note, it troubles me that for so many Alaskans, the first answer is rather than pay something for services, let's get someone else to pay. Let's get oil to pay. It's like, come on, people, pay a damn tax. It's not so bad. Everybody else does it.
Everybody else in the country?
Yeah.
Marge, anything to add to that?
I don't mean as a personal attack, it's just, couldn't we have a reasonable, well-constructed tax? It's not immoral, and also get some from the oil industry. That'd be nice, then we can split it. So
I think Larry gets at, that there's probably not one answer. There's probably a combination of answers.
Exactly.
That's probably what we're going to hear from legislative leadership on June 2nd.
Yeah.
Thank you both. The second question that I noticed, which Larry also answered, but I think probably the whole audience might like to hear, the question was really about how taxes might impact seniors. Are there taxes that won't impact seniors? And I just wondered, Larry, how you responded to that member of the audience, and if Marge, there's anything you'd like.
Well, I'm not sure you can construct, I guess you could have an income tax or a sales tax and exempt seniors, but then you're probably gonna, if you want to be fair, you're gonna have to exempt single moms, younger people, at some point, who's left to tax? So I can't really conceive of a tax that would fairly exempt seniors and tax everyone else.
And so, Barry, I think you're probably the best person on the AARP's behalf to answer this question about how the different impacts of the different types of broad-based taxes impact seniors.
Okay, so what we've seen around the country is that many states, in fact, do not tax Social Security income.
Right.
So I thought that that was noteworthy when I looked at this question. Actually, there are only 13 states that have an income. There are only 13 states total. Now, remember, some states don't have an income tax like Alaska, but there are only 13 states that do tax Social Security income. So one way the taxation of seniors is addressed potentially is by not taxing Social Security income. Also, another thing some states do is they allow seniors to deduct some of their other kinds of retirement income from taxation. So it's rare to see full exemptions for retirement income broadly, like all pensions or all 401k, although there are a few states, maybe 3 that do, but most states allow you to protect some of your retirement income from state taxation. So I guess, to that end, we'd really have to sort of see what would be workable in Alaska and how the legislature, the governor, and all stakeholders decided to move forward. But that's what we see around the country.
Excellent.
Okay. Something that went up in the chat, Marge, and I think this is sort of interesting in terms of like how you create a survey. One of the audience and the members of the audience wrote, does lack of relevant information cause people to be confused about things, such as raising our motor fuel tax from 8 cents to 16 cents? And I think that might mean, you're asking folks all these questions, but you also can't give all the information you'd like to when you're doing a survey. So I don't know if you want to comment about how the questions were created, or, the fact that the person would be on the phone forever if we tried to ask every single thing we wanted to. So I wanted to just give you a chance to talk about that for a minute.
Sure. So I'll just call your recollection back to Larry's slide that had the federal capital, the DC capital on the left, big, and then diminishing sizes of impacts of revenue streams to the state of Alaska. And so what we tested was not the smaller ones that would not really solve the situation, but the ones that had a potential to make a significant impact on the potential deficit, the existing deficit, and the potential deficit of the state. And so that's why we started with the oil and gas. If you think about kind of the middle oil and gas tax, and then we tested the broad-based impacts that would affect or impact all Alaskans, being, the PFD cut or cap, cuts to state services, and then the 2 broad-based taxes. So you're right, we can't test everything. We tested what we saw, and was guided by both Dittman as well as Larry, and our work with the legislature to be the biggest impact, the solutions that could have the biggest impact on the state budget overall. And then we reviewed the questions, to try to give as much information in those areas as we could without leading people to any particular answer or response.
Exactly. And I know that Larry just answered a question because I see it has disappeared, but this member of the audience was just making a comparison between Alaska and Texas. So I don't know, Larry, if there's anything you feel like you want to share, Texas,
No, the
oil
question
a
was,
lot.
right, Texas is a big oil producing state.
Mhm.
Texas does not have a personal income tax. Texas has a state sales tax of 6.25% on goods and services, plus a local sales tax. So Texas has gone with a heavy sales tax, no income tax.
Mhm.
But yeah, then they certainly tax oil too. North Dakota, which produces 3 times as much oil, or last year before COVID, 3 times as much oil as in Alaska, has an oil tax, an income tax, and a sales tax. They spread it out as we talk, so that no one entity, no one group, no one segment pays it all.
Okay.
And I'm going to have to take off. I'm sorry, to prep for a 1 o'clock.
That's okay. It looks like all of our questions,
Okay.
we've gotten to all of the questions that have been posed. So I just really want to thank Larry Persily for sharing his time and expertise with the AARP, and thank Madeline Holdor for serving as our state volunteer president and for being here to introduce our session today, and to thank Barry Tabenberger for helping us out with the questions as well as the development of this survey. And lastly, to thank, but not least, all of you for attending today, and for those of you who answered the survey, and and those who may want to continue to get more involved with the AARP on this issue. And with that, we will close and follow up with you all by email. And we thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.